There's a specific move an avoidant almost always reaches for once they realize, with genuine certainty, that someone has finally stopped caring. And it rarely looks like the dramatic pleading or desperate reconciliation attempts people often expect. It's quieter than that, more calculated in its effect even when it isn't consciously calculated in its execution, and it tends to land with a precision that catches people off guard, precisely because it doesn't feel like an attack at all. It feels instead like warmth, like vulnerability, like exactly the kind of emotional openness that had been missing throughout the entire relationship, arriving now, specifically, at the one moment it can do the most damage to someone's hard-won detachment. If the listener has recently stopped caring about an avoidant partner, has finally reached genuine indifference after considerable effort, and has watched that indifference get met with something that felt disarmingly sincere, something that momentarily reopened feelings they thought they'd successfully closed off. This exploration is going to name exactly what that move typically represents, and why understanding it matters enormously for protecting whatever hard-won peace has finally been achieved. To understand this specific pattern, it helps to understand what genuine indifference actually represents to an avoidant partner, because it functions very differently from anger, sadness, or ordinary relational distance. Anger still implies investment, sadness still implies attachment. Even distance, if it's accompanied by visible discomfort or lingering hope, still suggests the relationship retains some emotional charge. Genuine indifference removes all of this. It signals that the relationship has stopped mattering enough to produce any emotional reaction at all. And for an avoidant partner whose entire relational strategy depends on maintaining some degree of control over their partner's emotional engagement, this specific signal registers as uniquely threatening, considerably more threatening than anger or sadness ever managed to be. This is worth naming directly because it explains why the response to genuine indifference so often differs from the response to ordinary conflict or distance. An avoidant partner encountering someone's anger has considerable practice managing that specific emotion, deflecting it, waiting it out, sometimes even using it as further justification for their own withdrawal. Genuine indifference offers none of these familiar handles. There's no anger to deflect, no visible distress to wait out, nothing left to manage because the emotional stakes that previously fueled every interaction have simply disappeared. This absence tends to trigger something closer to genuine panic than the discomfort produced by ordinary conflict, and this panic frequently produces the specific move worth examining closely here. It's worth exploring what this move actually looks like in practice, because its effectiveness depends considerably on how genuinely it can be delivered, which means it often isn't consciously strategic at all, even though its function operates almost identically to a deliberate strategy. Faced with someone's genuine indifference, many avoidants suddenly access a depth of vulnerability, honesty, and emotional openness they never managed to demonstrate throughout the entire relationship, while it still mattered to them. Confessions of past fears never previously articulated. Genuine acknowledgement of specific harmful patterns, offered with apparent sincerity and detail that feels considerably more substantial than anything offered during earlier attempts at reconciliation. Sometimes even tears, or a visible emotional rawness that seems entirely inconsistent with the composed, guarded person the listener spent so long trying to reach. There's something worth naming about why this specific combination proves so uniquely effective at reopening feelings someone had genuinely closed off. It isn't simply that the avoidant is finally showing vulnerability, though that alone carries weight given how absent it likely was throughout the relationship's earlier stages. It's the specific timing, arriving exactly when the listener has stopped needing or expecting it, which makes it feel considerably more genuine and unprompted than it might have felt if offered earlier, when the listener was still actively requesting exactly this kind of openness. The vulnerability arrives, in other words, precisely when it's least expected, and therefore most disarming, precisely because indifference had already lowered the listener's defenses against exactly this kind of emotional appeal. It's worth examining whether this move is typically deliberate or unconscious, because the answer matters considerably for how it should be understood and responded to. In most cases, this isn't calculated manipulation in the deliberate, cynical sense many people initially assume once they recognize the pattern. It's closer to an automatic, self-protective response, the avoidance nervous system producing exactly the behavior most likely to restore the relationship's previous emotional stakes, without any conscious strategizing about how to achieve that outcome. This distinction matters, not because it makes the pattern less impactful or less worth protecting against, but because understanding its likely unconscious origin can help the listener respond with clarity, rather than either excessive suspicion or excessive sympathy, both of which can distort accurate assessment of what's actually happening. There's a particular quality worth naming about how this vulnerability, even when genuinely felt in the moment it's expressed, differs from vulnerability that would actually indicate sustained, lasting change. Genuine vulnerability offered in service of authentic repair tends to arrive independent of any specific trigger, like the listener's newfound indifference, motivated by internal reflection rather than by the immediate, urgent threat of losing access to someone who has finally stopped caring. Vulnerability that arrives specifically and exclusively in response to detected indifference, however sincerely felt, tends to be considerably more fragile, prone to receding once it succeeds in reopening the emotional engagement it was, consciously or not, designed to restore. It's worth exploring what typically happens once this move succeeds, because understanding the likely aftermath helps clarify why recognizing this pattern in advance matters so significantly. In many cases, once the listener's emotional engagement has been successfully reopened, whether through renewed hope, renewed hurt, or simply renewed attention paid to the avoidant partner's behavior, the depth of vulnerability that produced this reopening gradually recedes. The avoidant's usual defenses reassert themselves once the immediate threat of total indifference no longer feels imminent, and much of the openness that felt so significant in the moment it was offered proves, in retrospect, to have been considerably more temporary than it initially appeared. This pattern deserves honest, direct naming because it explains a specific and painful cycle many people experience without fully understanding its mechanics. Genuine indifference achieved through considerable effort, followed by a moment of apparently authentic vulnerability that reopens emotional investment, followed eventually by a return to the same distant patterns that originally produced the indifference in the first place. Recognizing this cycle for what it typically represents, rather than treating each instance of vulnerability as evidence of genuine, lasting transformation, matters enormously for protecting whatever progress has already been made toward emotional freedom from a relationship that has repeatedly failed to sustain genuine change. It's worth naming plainly here for the listener who has recently experienced exactly this pattern, watching hard-won indifference dissolve the moment an avoidant partner offered something that felt genuinely vulnerable and sincere. It's worth remembering that the sincerity of the moment itself doesn't guarantee the sincerity of what follows. Fear-driven vulnerability, however genuinely felt while it's being expressed, operates on an entirely different foundation than vulnerability that emerges from sustained, internally motivated growth, and only time, observed carefully and without the urgency of the immediate moment clouding judgment, can actually reveal which category any specific instance belongs to. There's something worth exploring about what protects against being repeatedly drawn back in by this specific pattern, because simple awareness of its existence, while valuable, often isn't sufficient on its own to prevent its effectiveness. What tends to work more reliably involves maintaining a clear, previously established internal standard for what genuine change would actually require. Specific, sustained behavior demonstrated over meaningful time, rather than a single moment of vulnerability, however compelling that moment feels in isolation. Having this standard established in advance before encountering the pattern directly makes it considerably easier to recognize the pattern accurately in the moment it's actually happening, rather than being swept into reconsidering the relationship status, simply because the immediate emotional experience feels so genuinely significant. It's worth examining too how this pattern connects to a broader truth about what actually motivates lasting change versus what merely produces temporary, crisis-driven behavior. Vulnerability offered specifically in response to detected indifference, regardless of how genuinely felt in the moment, remains fundamentally reactive rather than reflective, oriented around preventing a specific loss rather than around genuine, sustained commitment to becoming someone capable of consistent emotional availability. This distinction, while sometimes difficult to discern in the immediate heat of the moment, becomes considerably clearer with time, because genuine change persists under ordinary, undramatic conditions, while reactive vulnerability tends to fade once the immediate crisis that produced it has passed. There's a specific dimension worth exploring here concerning the physical experience this moment tends to produce for the listener, because it rarely announces itself as intellectually suspicious, even when careful reflection would eventually reveal it as exactly that. The body often responds before the mind has time to apply the kind of scrutiny that would recognize the pattern for what it is: a sudden warmth, a familiar flutter of hope, sometimes even physical relief, similar to what follows resolved tension. This physiological response makes complete sense given how deeply the nervous system had been trained, over the relationship's entire course, to associate this specific kind of vulnerability with genuine connection and safety. Recognizing that this bodily response, however real and however strong, doesn't necessarily indicate accurate information about what's actually happening, matters considerably for anyone trying to evaluate this moment with any real clarity, rather than simply being swept along by the immediate physical sensation it produces. It's worth examining how this pattern differs depending on the specific communication channel through which it arrives, because the medium itself shapes both its impact and how easily it can be evaluated with appropriate skepticism. A handwritten letter, a lengthy, carefully composed message, or an in-person conversation delivered with visible emotion tends to carry more immediate weight than a brief text or a passing comment, simply because the additional effort involved suggests, whether accurately or not, a proportionally greater sincerity behind it. It's worth naming that effort invested in the delivery of this vulnerability doesn't actually correlate reliably with the sincerity or sustainability of what's being communicated. An avoidant capable of crafting an unusually thoughtful, well-composed message in a moment of panic is demonstrating considerable capacity for language and self-reflection, but this capacity, impressive as it may be, still says nothing definitive about whether the underlying change will actually persist once the immediate crisis that produced it has passed. There's something worth naming about how mutual friends often factor into this dynamic, because they sometimes become inadvertent amplifiers of this specific pattern's effectiveness. An avoidant partner, having offered this moment of vulnerability directly to the listener, sometimes shares a similar, equally vulnerable account with mutual friends, whether seeking their own support or, less consciously, seeking validation that might eventually filter back to the listener through indirect channels. When this happens, the listener may encounter not just the avoidant's direct vulnerability, but corroborating second-hand accounts suggesting genuine emotional upheaval, information that can make the pattern feel even more convincing than it would if experienced through direct contact alone. Recognizing that these second-hand accounts, however seemingly independent, ultimately trace back to the same underlying reactive process doesn't diminish their emotional weight, but does help contextualize what they actually represent. It's worth exploring how this specific pattern sometimes escalates if the initial attempt doesn't succeed in dissolving the listener's indifference, because avoidants encountering unexpectedly sustained resistance to this move sometimes respond with increasing intensity rather than simply accepting the boundary and withdrawing. This escalation can include repeated attempts at vulnerability. each one framed as somehow more genuine or significant than the last, sometimes accompanied by explicit acknowledgement that previous attempts weren't received the way they'd hoped, followed by yet another attempt seemingly designed to finally succeed where earlier ones fell short. This escalating pattern deserves particular attention because its persistence, rather than indicating deepening sincerity, more often indicates deepening desperation, a nervous system working increasingly hard to restore an emotional connection that indifference has successfully and appropriately begun dismantling. There's a particular consideration worth naming about how this pattern interacts with an avoidance use of specific, carefully chosen language, because word choice during these moments often carries deliberate, if not always fully conscious, weight. Phrases explicitly acknowledging the listener's specific pain, using language that mirrors exactly what the listener themselves said during earlier, unsuccessful attempts to be heard throughout the relationship, can feel remarkably validating, precisely because it suggests the avoidant was actually listening all along, even when their behavior throughout the relationship suggested otherwise. This linguistic mirroring, while sometimes genuinely reflecting accumulated understanding, can also function, whether deliberately or not, as a particularly effective tool for reopening emotional engagement, precisely because it demonstrates a level of attunement that had been conspicuously absent when it actually would have mattered most. It's worth examining too how this pattern sometimes intersects with genuinely significant life events that provide a seemingly legitimate external explanation for the avoidant's sudden vulnerability, a health scare, a death in the family, a major professional setback, any of which can genuinely soften someone's usual defenses in ways unrelated to the listener's specific indifference. These situations deserve particular care in evaluation, because the vulnerability produced by genuine external crisis is real and deserves compassion, while still not necessarily indicating anything definitive about the relationship's long-term viability or the avoidant's sustained capacity for closeness once the external crisis itself has resolved. Distinguishing between vulnerability produced by external circumstance and vulnerability produced specifically by detected indifference requires careful attention to timing and content, but the distinction matters considerably for accurately understanding what's actually being witnessed. There's something worth naming about how this pattern connects to a broader question about self-trust that extends well beyond this specific relationship, because the capacity to recognize and resist this pattern effectively often depends significantly on how much the listener trusts their own prior conclusion that indifference, however difficult it was to achieve, represented an accurate assessment of the relationship's genuine health. Someone who arrived at indifference through careful, considered reflection rather than through impulsive frustration tends to hold that conclusion with more stability when confronted with this specific pattern, less likely to abandon hard-won clarity simply because a single moment of apparent vulnerability momentarily reintroduces doubt. This suggests that protecting against this pattern's effectiveness often begins well before the pattern itself ever appears, rooted in the quality and thoroughness of the reflection that produced the original indifference in the first place. It's worth exploring finally what a genuinely protective response to this pattern looks like in practical terms, beyond simply maintaining internal awareness of its likely mechanics. This often means deliberately creating space before responding at all, resisting the urge to immediately re-engage, regardless of how compelling the vulnerability initially feels, allowing enough time to pass that the immediate physiological and emotional response can settle before any decision gets made about how or whether to respond. It also means, when a response does eventually happen, communicating clearly that words alone, however moving, aren't sufficient to reopen what indifference had successfully closed, that sustained behavioral change over meaningful time remains the actual standard by which any renewed engagement will be evaluated, rather than the emotional intensity of any single moment, however genuinely felt that moment happened to be. It's worth naming too a specific variant of this pattern worth watching for, one that operates through demonstrated action rather than expressed vulnerability alone, sometimes proving considerably more convincing precisely because action tends to carry more weight than words in most people's assessment of sincerity. This variant involves the avoidant suddenly following through on specific requests that had previously gone unmet throughout the entire relationship, finally meeting family members who had been avoided, finally engaging in a specific activity that had been repeatedly declined, finally addressing a practical matter that had lingered unresolved for a considerable time. These actions, arriving precisely when indifference has taken hold, can feel like undeniable proof of change, precisely because they require more effort and follow-through than mere words alone would. It's worth examining this variant with the same careful skepticism applied to purely verbal vulnerability, because the timing itself remains the crucial variable. Actions taken specifically in response to detected indifference, however substantial, still originate from the same underlying reactive mechanism as vulnerability expressed through words, even when they happen to take a more concrete, seemingly harder to fake form. There's a particular pattern worth exploring regarding how this entire dynamic sometimes plays out across an extended timeline rather than in a single, identifiable moment, especially in longer relationships or in situations involving shared logistics like co-parenting that require ongoing contact regardless of the relationship's romantic status. In these extended scenarios, the pattern being described throughout this exploration doesn't always arrive as one dramatic instance of vulnerability, but instead unfolds as a sustained campaign. Small moments of unusual openness accumulating gradually over weeks or months, each one modest enough on its own to avoid triggering obvious suspicion, but collectively building toward the same effect that a single, more dramatic instance might achieve more quickly. Recognizing this slower variant requires paying attention to cumulative patterns rather than isolated incidents, noting whether a series of small, seemingly unconnected moments of vulnerability all happen to coincide with periods when the listener's own engagement or investment has visibly decreased. It's worth examining as well how professional support can meaningfully help someone navigate encountering this specific pattern, because the intensity of the immediate emotional and physiological response it produces often benefits considerably from outside perspective, less entangled in the immediate situation. A therapist familiar with these relational dynamics can help distinguish, in real time or shortly after the fact, between genuine reflection and reactive vulnerability, offering language and validation that makes maintaining appropriate skepticism considerably more sustainable than attempting to navigate the immediate emotional pull entirely without support. This becomes particularly valuable for anyone who has already experienced this exact cycle multiple times within the same relationship, because repeated exposure to this pattern without adequate outside perspective can gradually erode confidence in one's own judgment, making each subsequent instance progressively harder to recognize accurately despite growing accumulated evidence of the pattern's actual mechanics. There's something worth naming about how self-blame sometimes complicates the listener's ability to recognize this pattern clearly, particularly for anyone who has internalized, over the course of a difficult relationship, a habit of assuming their own perception or judgment is somehow unreliable or excessively suspicious. An avoidance vulnerability arriving precisely at the moment of detected indifference can trigger exactly this kind of self-doubt, a worry that recognizing the pattern accurately somehow reflects excessive cynicism or an inability to accept genuine change when it's actually being offered. It's worth naming directly that accurate pattern recognition, built on genuine, accumulated evidence rather than baseless suspicion, is not the same as cynicism, and trusting this accurate recognition represents genuine emotional intelligence rather than an unfair or ungenerous reading of someone else's behavior. It's worth exploring too how children complicate evaluation of this pattern when they're part of a longer relationship structure, because co-parenting arrangements sometimes create situations where continued contact, and therefore continued exposure to this specific pattern, remains unavoidable, regardless of the listener's own preferences. In these situations, developing a clear, consistent internal standard becomes particularly important precisely because ongoing contact means the pattern may repeat itself multiple times across an extended period, each instance requiring the same careful evaluation rather than allowing familiarity or exhaustion to erode the standard being applied. This ongoing vigilance, while genuinely demanding, ultimately protects not just the listener's own emotional stability, but also models for any children involved a healthier template for recognizing and responding to relational patterns than simply accepting each new instance of vulnerability at face value, regardless of its actual timing or context. There's a particular consideration worth naming about how this entire dynamic connects to a broader understanding of what genuine safety in any relationship actually requires, distinct from the momentary relief this specific pattern can produce. Genuine safety comes from predictability sustained consistently over time, not from a partner whose most convincing displays of vulnerability arrive specifically and exclusively in response to the threat of losing access to someone who has finally, appropriately, stopped investing further hope in the relationship's potential. A relationship or connection built primarily around this kind of crisis-triggered intensity, however emotionally powerful any individual instance might feel, rarely produces the sustained sense of security that most people are genuinely seeking, and recognizing this distinction clearly tends to matter considerably more for long-term well-being than resolving any single instance of this pattern in either direction. It's worth considering, finally, what this understanding ultimately offers the listener beyond simple protection from being repeatedly drawn back into an unsustainable dynamic. Recognizing this specific pattern accurately provides something considerably more valuable than defensive awareness alone, a genuinely clearer, more accurate picture of what actually motivates an avoidant partner's behavior across the entire relationship's history, not just in this specific moment. This clarity tends to support more durable, confident decision-making going forward, whether that means maintaining firm boundaries against this specific relationship's continued attempts at reconciliation, or simply carrying forward a more sophisticated understanding of relational dynamics that will likely prove valuable in evaluating any future partner's response to conflict, distance, or the genuine threat of loss. The vulnerability an avoidant offers upon detecting genuine indifference, however painful its effect on someone's hard-won peace, reveals something real and worth understanding clearly. That the indifference itself was working exactly as intended, that it represented genuine emotional freedom, significant enough to trigger the avoidant's most powerful, if largely unconscious, attempt at restoration. This reveals not weakness in the listener's boundary, but its actual strength. And recognizing this pattern for what it represents, rather than mistaking it for evidence that the boundary was somehow mistaken or premature, offers considerably more protection than simple awareness of the pattern's existence ever could provide on its own. There's one final thought worth carrying forward from everything this exploration has traced, because it applies regardless of how many times this specific pattern eventually resurfaces, and regardless of whether it ever fully stops appearing at all. Indifference achieved through genuine, sustained effort deserves to be protected as one of the more significant accomplishments available after a difficult relationship, not because indifference itself is the goal, but because it represents the hard-won product of finally accurately seeing a pattern clearly enough that its effects can no longer control the listener's emotional state. Each time this specific move gets recognized accurately, rather than falling for its considerable pull, that protection strengthens further, becoming somewhat easier to maintain the next time it inevitably reappears. What ultimately makes this understanding valuable isn't simply the ability to avoid being fooled by any single instance of this pattern. It's the deeper confidence that develops through repeatedly trusting one's own accurate perception over the compelling, momentary pull of a vulnerability that, however real it feels while being offered, was never actually built to last beyond the specific crisis that produced it in the first place. That confidence, once genuinely built through direct, lived experience rather than abstract understanding alone, tends to extend well beyond this specific relationship, shaping how the listener evaluates every future moment of unexpected vulnerability that arrives suspiciously close behind the discovery that someone's care has finally, quietly begun to fade. That extended pattern recognition, carried forward into every relationship that follows, tends to matter considerably more in the end than whatever eventually happens with the specific avoidant partner whose behaviour first prompted this entire understanding to develop, however painful and genuinely quite difficult the whole process of reaching it may have truly been.